大家好，我是 Jenny， 欢迎来到沉思者 J 向大师致敬系列。今天上场的是黑塞，他是一位用文字织就灵魂桥梁的学者，横跨东方与西方，横跨信仰与怀疑，横跨疯狂与清明。他的一生反复崩溃，又反复重生，几度站在悬崖边缘，却总能在文字里找到落脚之处。读懂黑塞，就像读懂一张内心的图，标示着每个人都会经过的迷路与觉醒，也标示着那条看不见却始终存在的归途。1877年，黑塞出生在德国小镇卡尔夫，父亲是新教传教士，母亲出身传教士家，家里弥漫严肃的宗教气息，餐桌上经常讨论罪与救赎。但真正影响他一生的是外祖父根德特。根德特曾常年驻留印度，深入研究当地的语言与文化。他通晓多种语言，编纂过印度方言词典，甚至协助翻译圣经。家里的书房摆满东方典籍与梵文手稿。年幼的黑塞常常翻阅那些异国卷册，听长辈讲述遥远的恒河故事。东方的种子悄悄埋进他心底，多年后才悄然发芽。少年黑塞性格倔强，敏感又早慧，不愿受教条束缚。13岁那年，他立志要当诗人，否则什么都不想当。家人送他进毛尔布隆神学院，盼他成为牧师，继承家族传教传统。但严格的规条令他窒息难耐。某个深夜，他翻墙逃离学校，独自在荒野里走了整整一夜，几乎冻僵。家人震惊之余，将他送往疗养院，又转送精神病院观察治疗。青春期的黑塞甚至萌生厌世念头，他曾用猎枪自尽未遂，被紧急送医救治。那段黑暗岁月成为他一生的伤痕，也成为日后作品中反复出现的母题。多年后他写信感叹，那些痛苦的少年后来都成为他笔下的角色。离开正规学校后，黑塞当过机械厂学徒，也做过书店店员，终日与书本相伴，阅读成为他的避难所，也是他自学的真正课堂。他开始尝试写诗，投稿四方杂志，屡屡遭到退稿，却从未放弃。1904年，小说彼得卡门欽出版，描写青年漫游山林寻找自我，一举成名。黑塞终于能以写作为生。随后他与玛利亚结婚，定居波登湖畔小村，过着简朴的田园生活，种菜养鸡，自食其力。1906年，他写下《车轮下》，揭露教育体制对少年的摧残，书中主角因升学压力崩溃致死。那其实是他自己童年的缩影，也是他对僵化教育最沉痛的控诉。第一次世界大战爆发，黑塞拒绝盲目爱国。他在报刊发表文章，公开呼吁学者保持理性，反对民族仇恨，呼吁欧洲文人团结而非互相撕裂。舆论一片挞伐，视他为叛徒，昔日友人纷纷与他断绝往来。压力之下，他迁居瑞士，远离祖国纷扰，并投入战俘救济工作，协助流亡学者重建生活。婚姻也逐渐出现裂痕，妻子精神状况恶化，时常需要住院疗养。3个儿子年幼，家庭重担全压在他肩上，他疲于奔命，却仍坚持每日写作。内外交迫，黑塞终于陷入严重崩溃，整夜失眠，头痛欲裂，几乎无法执笔。绝望之中，他求助心理学者朗格。朗格是荣格的弟子，引他走入分析心理学，剖析梦境与童年阴影。后来他甚至与荣格本人会谈数次，深入探索潜意识的奥秘，并尝试以绘画表达内心冲突。透过漫长对话，黑塞重新审视自己，潜意识里压抑多年的阴影逐渐浮现眼前。1919年，他写出小说《德米安》，书写一名少年挣脱旧有信仰，寻找内在真实的历程。起初他隐去真名，假托笔名辛克来发表，唯恐读者带着既定印象解读。这部作品轰动文坛，读者奉为心灵指南，纷纷猜测这位新人究竟是谁。后来真相揭晓，作者正是黑塞本人，他甚至主动婉拒原本颁给新人作家的文学奖项，以示诚实。这段时期，黑塞结识法国学者罗曼·罗兰。罗曼·罗兰同样关注印度思想，也是坚定的反战人士，两人因战争立场相近而结为知交。 彼此书信往来频繁，互相鼓励打气，讨论文学与信仰，也讨论欧洲文明的未来。罗曼·罗兰引介黑塞认识更多东方典籍，也让他知道遥远印度的甘地，以及那场以非暴力对抗帝国的运动。这段跨越国界的友谊，成为黑塞东方探索的重要支柱，也让他确信，个人内心的修炼与外在世界的和平，其实彼此相通。黑塞的身体始终称不上强健，剧烈头痛反复纠缠他大半生，发作时甚至无法睁眼视物，眼疾与痛风轮番找上门来，年纪渐长更是雪上加霜。许多人以为思想家总该超脱于肉身病痛之外，黑塞却坦言，正是这些反复发作的痛苦，逼着他学会与不适共处。他在书信里写道，疾病教会他耐心，也教会他谦卑。后来他笔下角色，几乎都要先经历身心的崩溃，才能换来真正的觉醒。痛苦对黑塞而言，从来不是阻碍，而是通往内在成长的必经关卡。其实早在1911年，黑塞曾远赴南洋，途经锡兰与印尼群岛。他渴望亲眼见证东方智慧的源头，补足童年听闻的种种传说。然而旅途颠簸，水土不服，身体屡屡抱恙，蚊虫与酷热令他寝食难安。眼前的东南亚充满贫困与混乱，殖民统治下的种种不公，也让他深感不安。理想与现实落差巨大，他在日记里写下深深的失望。返欧之后，黑塞终于明白一件事，真正的东方并不在的里的远方，而在每个人安静内省的深处。从此他不再仰赖远航，转而向内挖掘，向典籍与冥想求索。几年前前，黑塞酝酿出毕生代表作之一。1922年，小说《流浪者之歌》问世，故事设定在佛陀时代的印度。主角悉达多出身高贵，却不满足于既有教义，毅然离家修行。他历经苦行僧的境遇，又投入商贾的逸乐，尝遍人世的得意与荒芜。最终在河边摆渡为生，日日聆听流水低语。河水教会他，万物本是一体，过去未来，当下永恒，皆在这条河里交融流转。这部小说巧妙融合佛教思想与西方心理分析，它不是宗教说教，而是一场灵魂的私语，邀请读者一同倾听自己内心的河流。书中悉达多晚年也有一个儿子，那孩子无法理解父亲的智慧，愤而离家出走，留下悉达多独自在河边咀嚼遗憾。这段情节意外呼应黑塞自己与父亲的冲突，也预言了他日后与自己孩子之间同样难以跨越的隔阂。黑塞将这部作品题献给远方的知交罗曼·罗兰。婚姻终究走向终点，黑塞身心俱疲，独自搬进一座中世纪古塔栖居。1927年，他出版小说《荒野之狼》，剖析中年男子的精神困境。主角哈勒自称荒野中的孤狼，孤独游荡于市井之间。他厌恶市民生活的虚伪庸俗，却又无法彻底逃离，只能在矛盾中再浮再沉。书中描写一座魔幻剧场，无数扇门通往内心的不同房间，人格在里头分裂又重组。狼性与人性，理性与本能，在他体内激烈交战，难分难解。这部小说直指现代人精神的撕裂与孤独，许多读者读后惊呼，仿佛看见自己最隐秘的内心。书中那座魔幻剧场入口挂着一面醒目告示，写着入场资格仅限疯子，正常人请勿进入。哈勒犹豫许久，最终还是推门而入，因为他终于承认自己内心住着一个远比想象中复杂的灵魂。家庭生活始终是黑塞心头一道难解的课题。他与玛丽亚育有3个儿子，长子布鲁诺后来成为画家，继承了父亲对色彩的敏感，次子海纳，幼子马丁，各自走上不同的人生道路。然而黑塞自称自己并非称职的父亲，常年埋首写作，疏于陪伴孩子成长。这份愧疚，他从未真正放下，只能在书信与晚年的反思里，反复向儿子们致意，也反复在小说里安排父子之间的和解戏码，仿佛在虚构世界里替自己弥补现实中的缺憾。低潮期间，黑塞拾起画笔，自学水彩，作为心理治疗的延伸。西代话剧漫步瑞士南部山间，描绘当地的湖光山色与斜顶农舍。 画风简淡，留白甚多，色块明快，意境近似东方水墨的疏朗。他将部分画作制成明信片义卖，所得款项用来救助战争难民与流亡艺术家。文字之外，色彩成为他另一种修行方式，也让他重新找回对生活细节的单纯喜悦。度过低潮，黑塞遇见年轻的尼农，一位才华洋溢的艺术史学者。他成为他第3任妻子，悉心照料他的健康与写作，也是他晚年最重要的依靠。生活渐趋平稳，黑塞开始系统研读中国思想，他读老子，读庄子，也读易经卦象。汉学家魏礼贤翻译的德文版中国经典，成为他案头常客，反复批注，圈点再三。道家无为而治的智慧，与东方禅修的静观功夫，在他笔下逐渐交融成一种新的哲学语言。他发现，儒家强调的中庸，道家崇尚的自然，与印度教倡言的犯我合一，竟有异曲同工之妙，仿佛东方智慧本就同源而异流。易经里阴阳相生相克的观念，更让黑塞深受启发。他逐渐领悟，自己作品里反复出现的对立角色，狼与人，僧侣与艺术家，理性与本能，其实都呼应着阴阳消长的古老智慧。两极并非用来互相消灭，而是用来彼此映照，彼此成全，最终汇流成一个更完整的圆。这层体悟，往后成为他晚期作品最核心的精神骨架。1930年，他写下一部关于知性与感性对话的小说《纳尔齐斯与戈尔的盟》。一个代表理性自省的学者僧侣，一个象征感性流浪的雕刻艺术家。两种人生路径，看似全然对立，实则相互映照补全。这部小说延续他一贯主题，深入探索人性中相互依存又彼此撕扯的两极状态。二战阴影笼罩欧洲，远方的罗曼·罗兰也在战火将近时辞世，黑塞为老友的离去深深悲痛，却无法跨越边境送行。纳粹焚书名单上也出现黑塞的著作，他索性身居瑞士山间，谢绝一切政治表态。他以将近10年光阴，慢工细活，构筑最终的精神圣殿。1943年，巨著《玻璃珠游戏》终于完成，书中描绘一座虚构的未来修道院卡斯塔利亚。学者们玩着一种抽象游戏，将音符与数理哲思编织成精致的符号系统，借以追求纯粹的精神之美。主角克乃希特从学徒一路成为游戏大师，最终却选择离开高塔，下山投身真实人世，教导一名年轻弟子。这部小说是黑塞毕生思想的总结，他探问纯粹精神是否能够脱离尘世苦难而独立存在，答案隐隐指向否定。这部书在纳粹德国遭到查禁，只能在瑞士印行，辗转流传。同一时期，黑塞与小说家汤马斯·曼结为挚友，两人都因战争立场流亡海外，惜才相互敬重，书信往来持续数十年，互相打气，也互相批评。黑塞在蒙塔纽拉的山居生活，过得极为简朴。他亲手打理花园，种植蔬果与玫瑰，闲暇时收集邮票，享受不受打扰的宁静。访客形容他像一位隐士，谈吐温和，眼神却深邃锐利，仿佛随时都在倾听某种看不见的声音。1946年，瑞典学院将诺贝尔文学奖颁给这位隐居山林多年的学者。讲词赞扬他作品中大胆而深刻的精神探索，以及对人性整合的执着追求。黑塞当时健康状况不佳，并未亲自前往斯德哥尔摩领奖，只托人代为宣读简短的书面感言。他在信里写道，奖项属于文字本身，与他这个写字的人其实没有太大关系。然而战后初期，德语读者群尚未完全恢复，他的声名在德国一度沉寂，奖金与声望却为他带来实际的安稳生活，足以安心度过晚年。许多读者来信，人从世界各地寄到他山间的小屋，倾诉各自的困惑与孤独。黑塞总是亲自回复，字字恳切诚挚，几乎成了无数陌生读者的心灵导师，平均每天要写上好几封回信，直到视力衰退仍不愿假手他人。真正的高潮出现在他离世之后。60年代，美国青年掀起反叛文化浪潮，厌倦物质主义，渴求心灵出路。流浪者之歌与荒野之狼意外成为嬉皮士代随身携带的精神圣经。年轻人在书页里 找到反抗体制的勇气，也找到向内探索的具体方法。甚至有摇滚乐团直接借用荒野之狼为团名，向他致敬。一位活在20世纪初的德国学者，意外成为跨越时代、跨越大陆的心灵导师，影响力远远超出他生前的想象。1962年8月，黑塞在瑞士蒙塔纽拉病逝，脑血管病变，结束他85年起伏跌宕的人生旅程。临终前，他仍每日读书写信，照料花园里的植物，保持心灵澄澈安定。墓碑简朴无华，与他毕生追求的朴素哲学相互呼应，不立碑文，只刻姓名与年份。回望黑塞一生，东方与西方从未真正分离过。他的外祖父带来印度的种子，他的求索引出中国的智慧，他的文字融合基督信仰里忏悔与救赎的精神，最终都在河流的隐喻里找到统一。流浪者之歌里那条河，既像恒河，也像流经他故乡施瓦本丘陵的那条小河，更像每个人内心日夜流动的时间之河，承载着过去，也指向未来。黑塞曾说，人生真正的功课，不是急着寻找答案，而是学会与自己彻底和解。在分裂撕扯的世代里，他用一生的文学告诉我们，东方与西方，理性与本能，孤独与群体，终究可以在一个更深的层次合而为一，不必互相消灭。这就是黑塞，一位用整个生命书写融合之旅的学者。他的故事告诉我们，每一次内心的崩溃，都可能是重生的开端。每一段流浪，最终都通向回家的路，那条路，其实一直都在心里。时至今日，黑塞的书依然年年再版，被翻译成数十种语言，销量在德语文学里名列前茅。德国卡尔夫小镇，至今仍保留着一座以他为名的纪念馆，供世界各地的读者前往朝圣。馆内陈列着他的手稿与水彩画作，以及那把伴随他半生的老旧打字机。当代许多谈论正念与身心整合的书籍，往往都能在黑塞的文字里找到最早的雏形。他用1个世纪前的笔，写下至今依然切中人心的提问，提问着我们究竟是谁，又该往何处安顿自己。我们下次见咯。Hello everyone, I'm Jenny. Welcome to Thinker J. In our tribute to the Masters series, today we turn to Hermann Hesse, a writer who spent his whole life building a bridge between East and West, between faith and doubt, between madness and clarity. His life was full of collapse and rebirth, again and again, and more than once he stood at the edge of an abyss only to find solid ground again through writing. He was expelled from school, attempted suicide as a teenager, suffered repeated nervous breakdowns as an adult, watched 2 marriages fall apart, and was branded a traitor by his own countrymen during wartime, yet somehow he kept turning every one of these wounds into literature that would eventually speak to millions of strangers he would never meet. Understanding Hesse is a little like reading a map of the inner world, a map that marks the wrong turns and the moments of awakening that almost everyone passes through, and also the invisible road home that never quite disappears. Hesse was born in 1877 in the small German town of Kahl. His father was a Protestant missionary, and his mother came from a family with generations of missionary work behind it. The household was steeped in serious religious feeling, and conversations about sin and salvation were common at the dinner table. But the person who shaped Hesse most deeply was actually his grandfather, Hermann Gundert. Gundert had spent many years in India, studying local languages and culture in great depth. He was fluent in several languages, compiled a dictionary of an Indian regional language, and even helped with biblical translation work. The family library was filled with Eastern texts and Sanskrit manuscripts, along with carved statues and curious objects that travelers had brought back from distant ports. As a small boy, Hesse often leafed through these foreign volumes, listening to the elders tell stories of the distant Ganges, of temples and monks and faraway gods that seemed completely at odds with the strict Lutheran world he was raised in at home. A seed of the East was quietly planted in him, one that would not sprout for many years, but that would eventually grow into the central theme running through nearly everything he wrote. Young Hesse was stubborn, sensitive, and unusually mature for his age, and he refused to be bound by rigid doctrine. At 13 he declared that he wanted to be a poet or nothing at all, a statement his devout family found almost scandalous. His family sent him to the Malbrunn Seminary, hoping he would become a pastor and carry on the missionary tradition of the family. But the strict rules there, the endless memorization, the rigid timetable of prayers and lessons, nearly suffocated him. One night he climbed over the wall and ran away, wandering alone through the wilderness for an entire night until he was nearly frozen, with no plan beyond simply escaping the institution that felt like a prison to him. His shocked family sent him first to a sanatorium, then to a psychiatric institution for observation and treatment, where doctors of the time had no real framework for understanding a brilliant but deeply unhappy teenager. During this difficult adolescence, Hesse even developed thoughts of ending his life, and he once attempted suicide with a hunting rifle, which led to emergency medical treatment. That dark period left a permanent scar, and it later became a recurring theme in his work, the idea that conventional schooling and rigid social expectation could quietly destroy a sensitive young mind. Years afterward he wrote in a letter that all those suffering teenagers eventually became characters in his books, as if he could only make peace with his own pain by giving it to someone else on the page. After leaving formal schooling, Hesse worked as an apprentice in a machine factory and later as a bookshop clerk in the town of Tübingen, organizing shelves of rare and secondhand volumes for hours every day. Books became his constant companion, and reading turned into both a refuge and his real classroom of self-education, a kind of university he built for himself outside any formal institution. He began writing poetry and submitting it to magazines everywhere, facing rejection after rejection, yet he never gave up, continuing to write late into the night after long days behind the counter. In 1904, his novel Peter Camenzind was published, a story about a young man wandering through mountains in search of himself, and it made him famous almost overnight, finally allowing him to live by writing alone for the first time in his life. Soon after he married Maria Bernoulli, a gifted photographer 9 years his senior, and settled into a simple life by Lake Constance, growing vegetables, raising chickens, and largely supporting the household himself through long hours of disciplined writing. In 1906 he published Beneath the Wheel, exposing how a rigid education system could crush a sensitive teenager, with the main character collapsing under academic pressure and eventually dying. The story was really a portrait of his own childhood, and his most painful indictment of an inflexible school system that valued obedience over individuality. When the First World War broke out, Hesse refused to embrace blind nationalism, even as nearly every writer around him rushed to celebrate the coming conflict in patriotic verse. He published essays in newspapers calling on intellectuals to remain rational, opposing ethnic hatred, and urging European writers to unite rather than tear each other apart, arguing that culture itself was meant to transcend national borders rather than serve them. Public opinion turned harshly against him, branding him a traitor, and many former friends cut off contact entirely, sending him angry letters and refusing to publish his work. Under this pressure he moved to Switzerland, away from the turmoil of his homeland, and he also threw himself into relief work for prisoners of war, helping exiled scholars rebuild their lives and editing a newspaper distributed to German prisoners interned abroad. At the same time his marriage was falling apart, the mental health of his wife was deteriorating, with episodes severe enough to require repeated hospital care. With 3 young sons depending on him, the burden of the household fell entirely on his shoulders, and he was utterly exhausted, yet he still insisted on writing every single day, treating the discipline of a fixed writing schedule almost as a lifeline. Caught between these pressures from every direction, Hesse finally suffered a severe breakdown, lying awake through the night, his head splitting with pain, barely able to hold a pen, convinced for a time that he had nothing left to offer either his family or his readers. In his despair he turned to the psychologist Joseph Lang. Lang was a student of Carl Jung, and he led Hesse into the world of analytical psychology, dissecting dreams and unpacking childhood shadows over the course of more than 100 sessions. Later Hesse even met with Jung himself several times, exploring the mysteries of the unconscious mind and experimenting with painting as a way to express his inner conflicts, since Jung believed that images could often reach what words alone could not touch. Through these long conversations, Hesse began to re-examine himself, and shadows long repressed in his unconscious gradually surfaced, including buried resentment toward his strict religious upbringing and unresolved grief from childhood. In 1919, he published the novel Damien, about a young man breaking free of inherited beliefs in search of inner truth, guided by a mysterious older friend who seems to embody everything forbidden by conventional morality. He initially hid his real name and published the book under the pseudonym Emile Sinclair, fearing that readers would approach it with preconceived expectations shaped by his earlier, gentler novels. The novel caused a sensation, with readers treating it as a guide for the soul and speculating wildly about who this mysterious new author might be, and it even won a prize specifically created to encourage promising new voices. When the truth came out and the author was revealed to be Hesse himself, an already established writer rather than an unknown newcomer, he actually declined that literary prize meant for debut authors, as a gesture of honesty toward the genuinely new writers it was meant to support. Around this time, Hesse befriended the French writer Romain Rolland. Rolland shared his interest in Indian thought and was also a committed pacifist, having written extensively about the unity of mysticism across cultures, and the two men became close allies through their shared opposition to the war. They exchanged letters constantly, encouraging each other, discussing literature and faith, and debating the future of European civilization at a moment when most of their colleagues had stopped speaking to either of them. Rolland introduced Hesse to even more Eastern texts and told him about the distant figure of Gandhi and his movement of nonviolent resistance against empire, a figure who would later become enormously influential in how Europeans understood Indian spirituality. This friendship, crossing national borders, became an important pillar supporting Hesse in his exploration of the East, and it convinced him that inner spiritual practice and outer worldly peace were, in fact, deeply connected, two expressions of the very same underlying commitment to nonviolence. Hesse himself never had a particularly strong body. Severe headaches plagued him for most of his life, sometimes so intense that he could not even open his eyes for an entire day, and he often had to cancel meetings or postpone writing simply to lie still in a darkened room. Eye problems and gout took turns afflicting him, and things only grew worse as he aged, eventually limiting how many hours a day he could safely read or write by hand. Many people assume that great thinkers must somehow rise above physical suffering, but Hesse openly admitted the opposite. It was precisely these repeated bouts of pain that forced him to learn how to live alongside discomfort rather than waiting for it to disappear before he could feel whole. He wrote in letters that illness taught him patience, and it also taught him humility, stripping away any illusion that the mind could simply override the limits of the body. From then on, nearly every character he created had to pass through some kind of physical or emotional breakdown before reaching genuine awakening, a pattern so consistent across his novels that readers sometimes joked his heroes could never seem to find peace without first nearly falling apart. For Hesse, suffering was never simply an obstacle, it was an unavoidable gateway toward inner growth, a conviction he returned to again and again whenever younger admirers wrote asking him how to overcome their own pain. In fact, as early as 1911, Hesse had already traveled to Southeast Asia, passing through Ceylon and the Indonesian archipelago aboard a steamer, accompanied by a painter friend who shared his curiosity about the East. He longed to witness with his own eyes the source of Eastern wisdom he had heard so much about as a child, half expecting some kind of immediate revelation waiting for him on the docks. But the journey was rough, he suffered constantly from the unfamiliar climate, and the mosquitoes and oppressive heat left him unable to eat or sleep properly for much of the trip. What he actually found in Southeast Asia was widespread poverty and disorder, along with the visible injustices of colonial rule, all of which left him deeply unsettled and quietly ashamed of his own assumptions. The gap between his ideal and the reality in front of him was enormous, and he wrote of his deep disappointment in his journal, admitting that he had perhaps gone looking for a fantasy rather than a real place inhabited by real people with real struggles. After returning to Europe, Hesse finally understood something important. The true East was not located in some distant geography at all, but in the quiet depths of inner reflection that every person carries within. From that point forward he stopped relying on travel and turned instead toward inner excavation, searching through texts and meditation rather than through passports and steamship tickets. After several years of quiet incubation, Hesse produced one of the defining works of his life. In 1922 he published the novel Siddhartha, set in India during the time of the Buddha, a story he had actually struggled to finish for years before a sudden burst of clarity allowed him to complete the second half almost without revision. The protagonist Siddhartha is born into a noble family but remains unsatisfied with established doctrine, and he leaves home determined to seek his own path rather than accept wisdom secondhand from teachers, however wise they might be. He passes through the extreme asceticism of wandering monks, then immerses himself in the pleasures and commerce of worldly life, falling in love with a courtesan and learning the practical arts of business, tasting both the triumphs and the emptiness of human existence along the way. Eventually, worn down by years of pleasure that brought no real peace, he becomes a humble ferryman by a river, listening day after day to the murmur of the water alongside an old boatman who seems to need no other teaching at all. The river teaches him that all things are fundamentally one, that past, future, and the eternal present all merge and flow together within it, dissolving the very distinctions that had driven his earlier restless searching. The novel skillfully blends Buddhist thought with Western psychological insight, and it is not religious preaching at all, but rather an intimate whisper of the soul, inviting readers to listen to the river flowing within their own hearts regardless of what religion, if any, they happen to follow. Later in the story, an older Siddhartha has a son of his own, a boy who cannot understand the hard-won wisdom of his father and runs away in anger, leaving Siddhartha alone by the river to sit with his regret, finally tasting the same desperate love that had once driven his own father to let him go. This episode unexpectedly echoes the conflict Hesse himself once had with his own father, and it almost predicted the difficult distance that would later grow between Hesse and his own children. Hesse dedicated this work to his distant friend Romain Rolland, in gratitude for the years of correspondence that had helped guide him toward it. His marriage finally came to an end, and an exhausted Hesse, both physically and emotionally drained, moved alone into an old medieval tower, living almost like a hermit surrounded by half-unpacked boxes of books. In 1927 he published Steppenwolf, a sharp examination of the spiritual crisis facing a middle-aged man, written during one of the darkest stretches of his entire life. The protagonist, Harry Haller, calls himself a lone wolf of the steppe, wandering the city in isolation, keeping a private diary that the novel presents almost as a found document. He despises the hypocrisy and conformity of ordinary bourgeois life, yet he cannot fully escape it either, and he drifts endlessly within that contradiction, half longing for connection and half terrified of it. The novel describes a magic theater with countless doors leading into different rooms of the mind, where his personality splits apart and reassembles again and again, confronting him with versions of himself he had never dared to acknowledge. The wolf and the man, reason and instinct, wage a fierce war inside him with no easy resolution, and the novel resists offering readers any tidy answer about which side should win. The book speaks directly to the fragmentation and loneliness of modern people, and many readers were startled to recognize their own hidden inner life within its pages, often writing to Hesse to say the novel had described feelings they never thought anyone else shared. At the entrance to the Magic Theater hangs a striking sign, reading that admission is for madmen only and that ordinary people should not enter. Harry hesitates for a long time before finally pushing the door open, because he has finally admitted that a far more complicated soul lives inside him than he ever imagined, one made of countless selves rather than a single fixed identity. Family life remained, throughout the life of Hesse, a difficult and unresolved problem. He and Maria had 3 sons together. The eldest, Bruno, later became a painter, inheriting the sensitivity to color shown by his father, while the second son Heiner and the youngest Martin each went their own separate ways, one eventually working in publishing and the other becoming a photographer in his own right. Hesse himself admitted that he was never a particularly capable father, spending years buried in his writing while neglecting the daily lives of his children, often leaving them in the care of relatives or boarding schools for long stretches while he worked through his own breakdowns. This guilt never truly left him, and he could only return to it again and again, in letters and in late-life reflection, repeatedly reaching out to his sons, and repeatedly writing scenes of reconciliation between fathers and sons into his novels, as if trying to make up in fiction for what he had failed to provide in reality. In his later years, once his health and finances stabilized, he made a more deliberate effort to stay in contact, and the relationships with his sons, while never simple, did grow gentler with time. During this low point, Hesse picked up a paintbrush and taught himself watercolor painting as an extension of his psychological therapy, finding that color could often express what words, his usual tool, simply could not reach during the worst of his depression. He carried his painting supplies through the hills of southern Switzerland, capturing the play of light on lakes and the slanted roofs of mountain farmhouses, often setting out alone for an entire afternoon and returning with nothing but a single small canvas. His style was simple and restrained, leaving generous blank space, with quick bold patches of color, an aesthetic that felt remarkably close to the openness of East Asian ink wash painting, even though he had developed it almost entirely through instinct rather than formal study of any Asian tradition. He turned some of these paintings into postcards and sold them to raise money for war refugees and exiled artists, eventually producing thousands of small watercolor cards over the following decades. Beyond words alone, color became another form of practice for him, and it helped him rediscover a simple joy in the small details of everyday life, a joy that had nearly been crushed entirely by years of breakdown and conflict. After this low period passed, Hesse met the young Ninon Dolben, a brilliant art historian who had actually written him admiring letters for years before they ever met in person. She became his third wife, carefully looking after both his health and his writing, and she became the most important support of his later years, managing correspondence and household affairs so that he could finally write without constant disruption. As his life settled into greater stability, Hesse began systematically studying Chinese thought. He read Lao Tzu, he read Zhuangzi, and he studied the hexagrams of the I Ching, treating these texts not as exotic curiosities but as serious philosophical companions equal in depth to anything in the Western tradition he had grown up with. The German translations of Chinese classics by the sinologist Richard Wilhelm became constant companions on his desk, annotated and underlined again and again, with some pages so heavily marked that the original print became difficult to read beneath his notes. The Taoist wisdom of effortless action and the contemplative stillness of Eastern meditation gradually merged in his writing into an entirely new philosophical language. He came to feel that the Confucian ideal of the middle way, the Taoist reverence for nature, and the Hindu vision of the unity of self and universe were, surprisingly, expressions of the same underlying truth, as though Eastern wisdom had always flowed from a single source even as it branched into many different streams across different centuries and civilizations. The concept of yin and yang, mutually generating and mutually constraining each other within the I Ching, struck him with particular force, since it offered him a way of understanding contradiction that did not require choosing one side and discarding the other. He gradually realized that the opposing pairs of characters running through his own work, the wolf and the man, the monk and the artist, reason and instinct, were all echoing this ancient understanding of yin and yang in motion, two forces locked not in destruction but in an endless creative exchange. The two poles were never meant to destroy each other, but rather to reflect each other, to complete each other, eventually merging into a fuller and more complete circle, much as the I Ching itself describes change not as chaos but as a coherent pattern that can be read and understood. This insight became the central spiritual framework of his late period work, and Hesse later wrote that consulting the changing lines of the hexagrams gave him a kind of quiet clarity that formal Western philosophy had rarely offered him. In 1930 he wrote a novel built around a dialogue between intellect and feeling, called Narcissus and Goldmund. One character represents a rational and introspective monk, while the other embodies a passionate and wandering sculptor who leaves the monastery to experience love, hunger, art, and eventually the plague sweeping through medieval towns. The two paths through life appear completely opposed on the surface, yet in truth they reflect and complete one another, each man secretly envying qualities the other possesses and lacks. The novel continues a theme Hesse returned to throughout his career, exploring the way human nature contains poles that depend on each other even as they pull in opposite directions, and it remains, even today, one of his most beloved books precisely because it refuses to declare either the scholar or the artist the clear winner. As the shadow of the Second World War fell over Europe, his distant friend Romain Rolland passed away as the fighting drew toward its end, and Hesse mourned deeply for the loss of an old friend whose funeral he could not even cross the border to attend, writing privately that it felt as though one of the few people who had truly understood him was now gone. Books by Hesse himself also appeared on Nazi lists of works to be burned, and he chose to withdraw entirely into the mountains of Switzerland, refusing to take any public political stance even as friends and critics on both sides occasionally accused him of staying silent for too long. Over nearly a decade of slow, careful work, he constructed what would become his final spiritual cathedral, revising and rewriting entire sections multiple times in pursuit of exactly the right tone. In 1943 he completed his monumental novel The Glass Bead Game, set in an imagined future monastic order called Castalia, a province devoted entirely to scholarship and the cultivation of the mind, cut off from the noise and conflict of ordinary politics. There, scholars play an abstract game weaving musical notes, mathematics, and philosophical ideas into an elaborate system of symbols, all in pursuit of a kind of pure spiritual beauty that exists almost entirely for its own sake. The protagonist, Joseph Knecht, rises from student to Magister Ludi, master of the game, the highest honor Castalia can offer, before ultimately choosing to leave the towering order behind and descend into ordinary human life to teach a young student, convinced that wisdom locked away from the world eventually curdles into something hollow. The novel stands as the summation of lifelong thinking by Hesse, asking whether pure spirit can ever truly exist independent of worldly suffering, and the answer it quietly suggests leans toward no, since Knecht meets his fate almost immediately after stepping back into ordinary life, as though the real world simply could not be avoided forever. During the rise of Nazism in Germany, Hesse used what influence he still had to help other writers who were in far more danger than he was. He wrote letters of recommendation, helped arrange entry visas into Switzerland, and quietly sent money to Jewish and politically exiled colleagues who had lost their positions, their publishers, and sometimes their entire homeland almost overnight. He never sought public credit for this work, and much of it only came to light through letters discovered after his death. For a man often criticized, fairly or not, for retreating into private spiritual concerns while Europe burned, this quieter form of practical generosity reveals a side of him that rarely appears in his fiction, a willingness to act concretely on behalf of people he sometimes barely knew. The book was banned in Nazi Germany and could only be printed and circulated through Switzerland, smuggled in small numbers to readers who desperately wanted access to it anyway. If we step back and look across his major novels together, a single pattern becomes impossible to miss. Damien and Sinclair, Narcissus and Goldmund, the wolf and the man inside Harry Haller, even the scholar connect weighed against the ordinary world he eventually rejoins. Every one of these pairs is really the same underlying question asked in a different costume. Can the rational self and the instinctive self ever truly live together? Can discipline and freedom coexist without one eventually crushing the other? Hesse never gave readers a single tidy formula for resolving this tension, and that refusal is probably the real reason his books have stayed relevant across so many different decades and cultures. Each generation of readers arrives at his pages already carrying its own version of this same inner split, and each one finds, somehow, that Hesse had already been there waiting, asking the same question long before they were born. During this same period, Hesse formed a close friendship with the novelist Thomas Mann, who had settled not far away after fleeing Germany himself. Both men had gone into exile because of their wartime positions, and they deeply respected the talent each of them carried, exchanging letters for decades, encouraging one another while also honestly critiquing the work of the other, with Mann once calling Hesse the more daring and original spirit of the two despite his own greater fame at the time. The life of Hesse in Montagnola was extremely simple. His home, a yellow stucco house called Casa Camuzzi perched on a hillside overlooking Lake Lugano, became something of an informal pilgrimage site even during his own lifetime, with strangers occasionally appearing at the gate hoping for a brief word with the author who had shaped their thinking so deeply. He tended his own garden, growing vegetables and roses, and in his spare time he collected stamps, enjoying an undisturbed quiet that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the decades he had already lived through. Visitors described him as something like a hermit, gentle in conversation yet with eyes that were sharp and deep, as if he were always listening for some sound that others could not hear, and many left their meetings with him feeling that he had somehow understood them better in an hour than people who had known them for years. In 1946, the Swedish Academy awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature to this scholar who had spent so many years living quietly in the mountains, an honor that arrived at almost the exact moment Europe was beginning to take stock of everything the war had destroyed. The citation praised the bold and profound spiritual exploration found throughout his work, along with his persistent pursuit of human wholeness across decades of writing. The health of Hesse was poor at the time, so he did not travel to Stockholm to accept the award in person, instead asking someone else to read a brief written statement on his behalf while he remained at home in Switzerland. He wrote in a letter that the prize belonged to the words themselves, and had little to do with the man who happened to write them, a remark that struck some as modest and others as genuinely how he saw the relationship between an author and the work that outlives them. Yet in the early post-war years, German-speaking readers had not fully recovered their reading habits, distracted by the urgent business of rebuilding shattered cities, and his reputation inside Germany remained somewhat quiet for a time, even as the prize money and prestige gave him real and welcome stability in his later years. Letters from readers continued arriving from all over the world at his mountain home, full of confusion and loneliness they wanted to share, often from young people who felt they had nowhere else to turn. Hesse always replied personally, with sincere and heartfelt words, becoming something like a spiritual mentor to countless strangers, writing several letters a day on average, refusing to let anyone else take over even as his eyesight began to fail, treating each letter as seriously as he had once treated his own novels. It is worth pausing on one curious historical detail here. Most of these novels existed for decades only in German, and English translations of Siddhartha and Steppenwolf did not really reach a wide American audience until the 1950s, with paperback editions becoming widely available only shortly before the explosion of countercultural interest in the following decade. This timing was almost accidental, yet it meant that young readers in California and New York were essentially discovering a writer who had already lived an entire life and died, encountering his deepest crises as something startlingly fresh and new rather than as historical artifacts from interwar Europe. Had the translations arrived earlier or later, the strange alignment between the themes of Hesse and the cultural mood of that particular decade might never have happened at all. The true high point of his influence, strangely, arrived only after his death. In the 1960s, young Americans launched a wave of counterculture rebellion, weary of materialism and hungry for some kind of spiritual alternative to the conventional paths their parents had followed. Siddhartha and Steppenwolf unexpectedly became sacred texts that the hippie generation carried with them everywhere, passed from hand to hand on college campuses and at gatherings far removed from the quiet Swiss village where Hesse had written them. Young readers found in these pages the courage to resist established institutions, as well as concrete methods for turning inward and exploring their own minds, methods that did not require belonging to any particular religion or following any single guru. A rock band even borrowed the title Steppenwolf directly as its name, in tribute to him, going on to have major hits that introduced his work to listeners who had never opened one of his books. Universities across the United States began including his novels in literature and philosophy courses, and academic interest in his work grew steadily even as his initial readers aged out of their college years and into careers of their own. A German scholar who had lived through the early 20th century unexpectedly became a spiritual guide crossing both time and continents, with an influence far beyond anything he could have imagined during his own lifetime, when he had often felt himself to be a relatively minor and frequently misunderstood writer. Despite all the turmoil running through his personal life, Hesse maintained an almost monastic discipline around the act of writing itself. He typically rose early, worked through the calmest hours of the morning when his head was clearest, and treated even his worst periods of illness as something to write around rather than something that gave him permission to simply stop. He revised slowly and carefully, often producing several complete drafts of a single chapter before he was satisfied, and he kept meticulous diaries and notebooks that historians and biographers still mine today for insight into exactly how his ideas evolved over time. For someone whose books are so often about chaos, breakdown, and the dissolving of fixed identity, the actual daily process behind them was remarkably steady, structured, and patient, a reminder that even the most turbulent inner journeys can be carried forward by very ordinary habits of consistent effort. In August of 1962, Hesse died in Montagnola, Switzerland, from a cerebral hemorrhage, bringing an end to an 85-year life full of dramatic rises and falls. Right up until the end, he continued reading and writing letters every single day, tending the plants in his garden, keeping his mind calm and clear despite the various ailments that had followed him for decades. His gravestone is simple and unadorned, in keeping with the plain philosophy he pursued throughout his life, bearing nothing but his name and the years of his birth and death, with no grand inscription summarizing a life that had, by then, already been summarized many times over in his own books. Looking back over the entire life of Hesse, East and West were never truly separate at all. His grandfather planted the seed of India, his own searching drew out the wisdom of China, and his writing wove together the spirit of confession and redemption found in Christian faith, all of it eventually finding unity in the metaphor of the river. The river running through Siddhartha resembles the Ganges, and it also resembles the small river that wound through the hills of his own Swabian homeland, but most of all it resembles the river of time flowing endlessly within every human heart, carrying the past while pointing toward the future, indifferent to the borders and labels that human beings draw upon its surface. Hesse once said that the real task of life is not to rush toward answers, but to learn how to make complete peace with oneself, a lesson he himself only learned slowly, through repeated collapse rather than any single moment of sudden insight. In a fractured age, his lifetime of writing tells us that East and West, reason and instinct, solitude and community, can ultimately become one at a deeper level, without needing to destroy each other, much as the two interlocking halves of the yin and yang symbol need each other to form a complete circle. This is Hermann Hesse, a scholar who spent his entire life writing a journey of integration. His story tells us that every inner collapse can become the beginning of a rebirth, and that every act of wandering eventually leads back toward home, a home that, in truth, has always lived inside us, waiting patiently for us to stop searching everywhere else and finally look within. Perhaps that single idea, more than any specific plot or character, is the real reason his books refuse to go out of date. Even today, books by Hesse continue to be reprinted year after year, translated into dozens of languages, with sales that remain among the highest in all of German literature, still discovered each year by new teenagers going through the very same restless questioning he once experienced himself. The small German town of Kahl still maintains a museum dedicated to him, drawing readers from around the world who come almost as pilgrims, with exhibits including his manuscripts, his watercolor paintings, and the old typewriter that accompanied him through much of his life. Many contemporary books about mindfulness and psychological integration can trace their earliest seeds back to the writing of Hesse, even when their authors never mention his name directly. With a pen from a century ago, he wrote questions that still cut straight to the heart of who we are today, and where we might find a place to truly belong, questions that, it seems, each generation has to discover and answer for itself all over again. See you next time.